Sometimes the heaviest inheritances aren't what you carry in your hands, they're what you carry in your heart. When 60-year-old Wes Callahan returned to his late uncle's Montana ranch to settle the estate, he expected nothing more than rusted tools and faded memories. What he found beneath a rotted tarp in the old stable would shake everything he believed about his family. Inside a locked trunk lay gold coins, Civil War relics, and a pistol engraved with the Callahan name. But the letter from his uncle changed everything, revealing a decades-old betrayal, a wrongly accused brother, and a family secret buried to protect an honor already lost. What would you do if your family's greatest treasure was also its darkest secret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from Billings to the old Callahan ranch took Wes 3 hours, but it felt like traveling back through 50 years of memory. The highway stretched out before him, cutting through endless fields of dried grass that swayed in the September wind like waves on a forgotten ocean. He'd made this journey countless times as a boy, pressed against the window of his father's pickup, watching the landscape shift from town to wilderness. Back then, his Uncle Ray's place had seemed like the edge of the world, a place where the rules of civilization bent just enough to let a man breathe free. Wes gripped the steering wheel of his Ford F-150, feeling every one of his 60 years in his lower back and the stiffness in his left knee. The radio played low, some talk station discussing things that felt far removed from where he was headed. He turned it off. The silence suited him better anyway. Uncle Ray had been dead 3 weeks when the call came. A lawyer in Miles City, speaking in that careful tone people use when delivering news about the departed. Ray had left everything to Wes, the ranch, the land, whatever remained of a life lived mostly alone. The lawyer mentioned there wasn't much of value, just the property itself, and whatever personal effects Ray had accumulated over 7 decades. Wes had thanked him and said he'd come up to handle things properly. The truth was, Wes hadn't seen Ray in almost 10 years. Life had a way of creating distance, even when you didn't mean for it to happen. Work had consumed him, first as a ranch hand himself, then as a foreman for the Patterson spread down in Wyoming. Marriage, then divorce. A son who'd moved to Seattle and called twice a year if Wes was lucky. The years had slipped by like water through fingers, and suddenly Ray was gone, and Wes was the only one left who remembered what the Callahan name used to mean in this part of Montana. The turnoff came up on his right, marked by the same weathered wooden sign that had been there since Wes was a child. Callahan Ranch, carved into pine, the letters nearly worn smooth by decades of wind and weather. The dirt road beyond wound through a corridor of cottonwoods, their leaves already showing the gold and rust of early autumn. Wes eased the truck onto the rutted path, feeling every bump and pothole jar through the suspension. When the ranch house came into view, something tightened in his chest. It looked smaller than he remembered, more vulnerable somehow. The white paint had gone grey and was peeling in long strips. The porch sagged on one side, and several windows were dark with grime. The barn stood behind the house, its red paint faded to a dusty rose, and beyond that, the old stable where Ray had kept his horses back when he still rode. Wes pulled up in front of the house and cut the engine. For a long moment, he just sat there, taking it all in. The place smelled like sage and dust and something else, the particular scent of abandonment, of a life that had wound down to nothing. A magpie called from somewhere in the cottonwoods, its harsh voice, the only sound besides the ticking of the truck's cooling engine. He climbed out slowly, feeling his joints protest. The September sun was warm on his shoulders, but there was an edge to the air that promised winter wasn't far behind. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked toward the house, the sound too loud in the stillness. The front door was unlocked. Ray had never been much for security, always said that anyone desperate enough to rob him was welcome to whatever they could carry. Inside, the house was dim and close, smelling of old coffee and wood smoke. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the dirty windows. Wes stood in the front room, looking at the sparse furniture, the photographs on the mantel, the accumulation of a solitary life. There was Ray as a young man, lean and dark-haired, standing next to a horse. Ray and Wes's father, both in their 20s, grinning at the camera with their arms around each other's shoulders. That photo must have been taken before the split, before whatever had happened to drive them apart. Wes picked it up, studied the faces of two brothers who'd once been close enough to share everything. His father never talked about it. Whatever had caused the rift between him and Ray had been buried deep, and when Wes's father died 15 years ago, he'd taken the story with him. Ray had come to the funeral, stood at the back of the church, and left before anyone could speak to him. Wes had always meant to ask, to bridge that gap somehow, but he never had. Now both brothers were gone, and the truth of it had died with them, or so he'd thought. Wes set the photograph back on the mantel and moved through the house, taking inventory. The kitchen was clean enough, dishes washed and stacked beside the sink. The bedroom held a narrow bed with military corners on the blanket, a dresser with nothing on top but a lamp and an old pocket watch. In the closet, Wes found Ray's clothes, hanging in neat rows, work shirts, a good jacket, a dress uniform from Ray's time in Korea that he'd apparently kept all these years. The whole place spoke of order, of a man who'd kept his life simple and contained. But there was a loneliness to it too, a sense of things left unsaid and undone. Wes felt it like a weight in his chest as he walked from room to room. By the time he'd finished with the house, the sun was lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Wes stepped back outside, grateful for the fresh air. He needed to check the outbuildings, see what condition they were in. The barn first, then the stable. After that, he'd figure out what to do with all of this, whether to try to sell it or let it go back to the bank or the state. The barn doors stood half open, one hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the space was cavernous and dim, filled with the ghost smell of hay and livestock. A few old tools hung on the walls, shovels, a pickaxe, coils of rope gone stiff with age. In one corner, Wes found a workbench covered in coffee cans, full of nails and screws, organized by size. So like Ray, even his junk drawer military neat. An old tractor squatted in the center of the barn, its tires flat and its paint oxidized to a dull orange. Wes ran his hand along the hood, leaving a trail in the dust. He remembered Ray teaching him to drive this thing when he was 12, letting him steer while Ray worked the pedals. The memory came with the phantom smell of diesel fuel and cut alfalfa, so vivid it made him ache. He moved on, climbing over scattered hay bales and ducking under low beams until he emerged from the barn's far side. The stable was 50 yards away, a long, low building with a roof that dipped in the middle. Wes had spent whole summers here as a boy, helping Ray care for the horses, learning to brush them and feed them and muck out their stalls. Ray had been patient then, always willing to show him the right way to do things, never harsh when Wes made mistakes. The stable doors were closed, secured with a rusted padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Wes frowned. He'd expected the place to be abandoned, but accessible, like the barn. Why would Ray lock it up? What was there to protect in an empty stable? He went back to his truck and retrieved the keys the lawyer had given him, a ring with a dozen different keys, none of them labeled. It took him 10 minutes of trial and error before one finally turned in the lock. The shackles sprang free with a metallic snap, and Wes pulled the doors open. The hinges shrieked in protest, and a wave of stale air rolled out, thick with the smell of old straw and decay. Wes stepped inside, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. Light filtered through cracks in the walls and gaps in the roof, creating thin beams that cut through the darkness like searchlights. The stable was empty of horses, had been for years by the look of it. The stall doors stood open, their interiors dark and silent. Cobwebs stretched across the corners, thick as curtains. Mice had made homes in the scattered hay, their tiny droppings everywhere. It was exactly what Wes had expected, a building that had outlived its purpose, slowly surrendering to time and neglect. He was about to leave when something caught his eye in the far corner. A shape beneath a tarp, bulky and oddly squared off. He moved toward it, his boots stirring up clouds of dust. The tarp was heavy canvas, rotted through in places, its edges frayed. It covered something large, something deliberately concealed. Wes grabbed a corner of the tarp and pulled. The fabric tore with a sound like ripping paper, and beneath it, revealed in the dim light, was a trunk. Not just any trunk, but an old steamer trunk, the kind people had used to cross oceans 100 years ago. It was made of wood, reinforced with metal bands, its surface pitted with age and scarred with use. A heavy padlock hung from the hasp, and on the lid, barely visible beneath layers of grime, someone had burned a design into the wood. The letter C, surrounded by a circle, the mark of the Callahan family. Wes knelt beside it, his heart suddenly beating faster. He tried the lock, but it held firm. Back to the keyring, another 10 minutes of testing until he found the right one. The lock opened with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the silent stable. For a moment, Wes didn't move. Something about this felt significant, momentous in a way he couldn't quite name. Whatever was in this trunk, Ray had hidden it deliberately, had locked it away and concealed it beneath a tarp in an abandoned stable. Whatever was inside mattered. Wes took a breath and lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was gold. Not just a coin or two, but dozens of them, hundreds maybe, gleaming even in the weak light. They were heavy gold pieces, some with dates from the 1860s, others older. Beneath the coins, wrapped in oilcloth, were objects that made his breath catch. A Confederate officer's pistol, its walnut grip polished smooth by use. A cavalry saber with brass fittings, a stack of documents tied with string deeds, letters, maps drawn in faded ink. And on top of everything, a single envelope addressed in Ray's familiar handwriting, for Wes, when he's ready to know the truth. Wes lifted the envelope with shaking hands. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for important correspondence. He turned it over, saw that it was sealed with wax pressed with the same C and circle mark from the trunk's lid. He broke the seal carefully and pulled out the letter inside. The handwriting was Ray's, but shakier than Wes remembered, as if written late in life or under great strain. He began to read, and with each line, the stable seemed to grow colder around him. The truth wasn't what he'd expected. It was so much worse and so much more complicated than anything he could have imagined. The letter began simply enough. Wes, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And it's time someone in this family knew what really happened to our grandfather, Silas Callahan, and why your father and I could never stand to be in the same room after 1975. Wes stood there in the dusty stable, holding a letter from a dead man, surrounded by gold and relics from a war fought before his grandparents were born. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of blood and fire. And inside, in the growing darkness, Wes Callahan began to learn the truth about his family, a truth that had been buried for 2 generations. Waiting for someone to finally dig it up, the letter trembled in his hands as he read on, and with each revelation, the weight of inheritance settled more heavily on his shoulders. Not the inheritance of property or wealth, but the inheritance of secrets, lies, and a betrayal that had fractured his family so completely that even death hadn't healed it. By the time he finished reading, full darkness had fallen. Wes stood alone in the stable, the letter still in his hands, tears running down his weathered face. He understood now why Ray had hidden this away, why he'd chosen to carry the burden alone. The question was whether Wes was strong enough to carry it now, or whether some truths were better left buried in the dust. Wes drove back to town in silence, the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. He'd left the trunk in the stable, closed the doors, and locked them again. The letter was folded in his shirt pocket, pressed against his heart. He'd read it 3 times, each time hoping he'd misunderstood, but the words never changed. Miles City wasn't much to look at after dark, a main street with a few shops, a couple of bars, a motel with a vacancy sign flickering in neon. Wes pulled into the parking lot of the Trail's End Inn, a low building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1972nd. He checked in with a clerk who barely looked at him, took the key to room 12, and carried his duffel bag down the outdoor corridor. The room smelled like old smoke and pine cleaner. A double bed with a floral bedspread, a television bolted to the dresser, a bathroom with tiles the color of rust. Wes dropped his bag on the bed and sat down heavily, feeling the springs protest beneath his weight. Through the thin walls he could hear a television playing, canned laughter from some show he didn't recognize. He pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again, this time slowly, trying to absorb every detail. Ray's handwriting sprawled across 3 pages, the story unfolding in fits and starts, as if he'd had to keep stopping to gather his nerve. The core of it was this: their grandfather, Silas Callahan, had been a prospector and sometime rancher who'd struck gold in the mountains north of Miles City in 1889. Not a big strike, but enough to buy land, build a ranch, set his family up for generations. He'd kept the gold hidden, knowing that word of a strike could bring trouble, and for years he'd been careful about how he spent it, never drawing too much attention. When Silas died in 1942, he'd left instructions with his 2 sons, Ray and Wes's father, James, about where to find the gold and what to do with it. But there was a complication. Silas had also left a detailed account of how he'd gotten the gold in the first place, and that account made for ugly reading. The gold hadn't all been his. Some of it had belonged to a man named Thomas Whitmore, a fellow prospector who'd partnered with Silas on the claim. According to Silas's account, there'd been an argument about how to split the find. Tempers had flared, and in the struggle that followed, Whitmore had died. Silas claimed it was an accident, self-defense, but he'd panicked and buried the body where no one would find it. Then he'd taken everything, the gold, the maps, the claim papers, and disappeared into the Montana wilderness for 5 years before returning to start the ranch. For 50 years, Silas had carried the guilt. The confession he'd written was his attempt at unburdening himself before death, an explanation left for his sons to puzzle over. But here's where things got complicated. Thomas Whitmore had a son, a boy who'd grown up poor and bitter, always believing his father had abandoned him. That son, Marcus Whitmore, had eventually made something of himself, became a lawyer, then a judge, gained influence and connections throughout Montana. When Ray and James found Silas's confession, they'd faced an impossible choice. If they revealed the truth, they'd destroy their father's reputation and likely lose the ranch. The gold would be claimed by the Whitmore estate, and there might even be criminal liability for concealing a death. But if they stayed silent, they'd be complicit in covering up what amounted to murder, even if it had happened decades ago. James had wanted to come clean. He'd argued for turning everything over to the authorities, letting the chips fall where they would. But Ray had disagreed. He'd pointed out that Marcus Whitmore was powerful enough to destroy them completely, that telling the truth would accomplish nothing except ruining their own lives. The dead man wouldn't be any less dead, and the Callahan family would be finished. They'd fought about it for months, Ray wrote, their arguments growing more bitter until finally James had issued an ultimatum. Either Ray agreed to reveal the truth, or James would do it himself. Ray had made a choice. He'd taken the trunk, all the gold, all the evidence, Silas's confession, and hidden it away. Then he'd told James he'd destroyed everything, that there was nothing left to reveal. James hadn't believed him. The brothers had parted ways in anger, James convinced that Ray was a coward and a liar, Ray certain that he'd saved the family from destruction. For the next 40 years, they'd barely spoken, the rift between them too wide to bridge. And Ray had carried the secret alone, never telling anyone where he'd hidden the trunk, never touching the gold except to count it occasionally and make sure it was still there. Now it was Wes's burden. Ray's letter made that clear. I'm giving this to you, Wes, because you're the last one left who cares about the Callahan name. Your father's dead, I'll soon follow, and you're the only one who can decide what to do with this mess. Maybe you'll have the courage to do what's right, whatever that turns out to be. Or maybe you'll understand why I did what I did, and you'll let sleeping dogs lie. Either way, the choice is yours now. I'm sorry to leave it with you, but I'm too tired to carry it any further." Wes folded the letter and set it on the nightstand. His hands were steady now, but his mind was racing. The implications were staggering. If he revealed the truth, he'd vindicate his father's position. James had been right to want to come clean. But he'd also be admitting that his family's entire legacy was built on theft and possible murder. The ranch would be forfeit, the Callahan name would be mud, and for what? To give a fortune to the descendants of a man who'd been dead for 80 years? On the other hand, if he kept the secret, he'd be doing exactly what Ray had done, choosing family loyalty over truth, protecting the Callahan name at the expense of honesty. He'd be proving that James had been wrong, that silence was the better choice. But he'd also be living with the knowledge of what his grandfather had done, carrying that weight for however many years he had left. And there was another complication, one that Ray had mentioned only briefly in the letter. Marcus Whitmore had died in 1998, but he'd left children and grandchildren. One of them, a man named David Whitmore, had become a state senator, representing this part of Montana in Helena. Ray had kept track of the family over the years, watching from a distance, always worried that someone would start asking questions about Thomas Whitmore's disappearance. So far, no one had. The assumption had always been that Thomas had died in the mountains, his body lost to time and wilderness. It was a common enough story in the prospecting days. Men went into the high country chasing gold and never came back. But if Wes revealed the truth now, it wouldn't just be a historical curiosity. It would be a scandal involving a prominent political family, and David Whitmore had the power and resources to make Wes's life very difficult if he chose to. Wes stood and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for a few cars. The sky was clear, stars visible despite the glow from the town's lights. He could see the outline of mountains to the west, dark shapes against a dark sky. He thought about his father, how James had always been the moral center of the family, the one who insisted on doing the right thing, even when it cost him. James had worked hard his whole life, never cutting corners, never lying or cheating, even when it would have made things easier. He'd raised Wes with those same values: honesty, integrity, the belief that truth mattered more than comfort. And then he thought about Ray, who'd spent 40 years alone on that ranch, carrying a secret that had poisoned his relationship with his only brother. Ray had made a choice he thought was right, and it had cost him everything: his family, his peace of mind, any chance at companionship in his final years. The secret had isolated him as surely as if he'd locked himself in a cell. Was that the price of loyalty? Was that what protecting the family name had earned Ray Callahan? Wes returned to the bed and lay down without undressing, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Sleep felt impossible, but eventually it came anyway, bringing dreams of dark stables and locked trunks, of gold coins that turned to ash in his hands, of his father and uncle standing on opposite sides of a chasm too wide to cross. When he woke, the room was filled with grey dawn light, and he knew what he had to do. Not the full answer, not yet, but the first step. He needed to learn more about Thomas Whitmore, about what had really happened on that mountainside in 1889. He needed to see if Silas's account could be verified, if there was any way to know whether it had truly been an accident or something darker. And maybe, just maybe, he needed to meet David Whitmore and see what kind of man carried the name of the family his grandfather had wronged. Wes spent the morning in the Miles City Public Library, a small brick building on Main Street that smelled like old paper and floor wax. The librarian, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and glasses on a chain, greeted him with practiced warmth. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking for historical records," Wes said. "Old newspapers, property records, anything about prospecting in this area in the late 1800s. Her eyes lit up. "We have some of that on microfiche, and the county clerk's office keeps property records going back to statehood." "What specifically are you researching?" "A man named Thomas Whitmore. He would have been prospecting somewhere around 1889. Whitmore." She tapped her chin thoughtfully. That name's familiar. Hold on. She disappeared into the back and returned 5 minutes later with a cardboard box. We have a small collection on the Whitmore family. Someone donated it years ago when old Marcus died. Mostly just family papers, nothing organized, but you're welcome to look through it. Wes took the box to a table by the window and began sorting through the contents. There were letters, photographs, legal documents, newspaper clippings, the detritus of a family's history, preserved by accident more than design. He worked slowly, reading each item carefully, building a picture of Thomas Whitmore's life. Born in Ohio in 1856, Thomas had come west in 1884, chasing the promise of gold and new beginnings. He'd married a woman named Sarah, and they'd had a son, Marcus, in 1886. But the marriage hadn't lasted. Sarah had taken the boy and returned to Ohio, unable to handle the hardship of frontier life. Thomas had stayed in Montana, writing letters home that promised he'd strike it rich and send for them soon. Those letters stopped in November 1889. Wes found copies of them in the box, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The handwriting was educated, the language formal but warm. Thomas wrote about the beauty of the mountains, the excitement of finding a promising claim, the partner he'd taken on to help with the work. A man named Wes Callahan, Thomas had written in August 1889. Rough around the edges, but honest, I think. We've agreed to split whatever we find 50-50. With two of us working the claim, we should be pulling decent color by winter. The next letter, dated October 1889, was less optimistic. Silas and I have been arguing about how to proceed. He wants to file the claim under his name alone, says it's safer that way, but I don't trust the arrangement. I've told him we need to register as partners, make everything legal. He's grown sullen about it, barely speaking to me most days. I'll give him another week to see reason, and if he won't, I'll have to find another partner. That was the last letter. After that, nothing but silence. Wes sat back, feeling sick. Silas's account had mentioned an argument, but he'd portrayed it as a sudden flare-up, a tragic accident born of momentary anger. These letters painted a different picture, one of mounting tension, of Silas maneuvering to cut Thomas out of the claim, of Thomas recognizing the danger but not acting quickly enough. There was more in the box. A newspaper clipping from December 1889, just a few lines. Local prospector Thomas Whitmore has not been seen in Miles City for over a month. Friends express concern, but authorities note that men often winter in the mountains near their claims. Search efforts will commence in spring if Whitmore has not returned by then. Another clipping from May 1890. No trace has been found of prospector Thomas Whitmore, missing since November. His claim in the Bear Creek area has been abandoned. Family in Ohio has been notified. And then, most damning of all, a property record showing that Wes Callahan had filed a claim on the Bear Creek site in March 1890, 4 months after Thomas disappeared. He'd listed himself as the sole owner, made no mention of a partner, and within 2 years had sold the claim to a mining company for what the records called a substantial sum. Wes photographed everything with his phone, then returned the box to the librarian. "Is there a cemetery in town?" he asked. "Somewhere that might have graves from the 1800s? Hillview Cemetery, east end of town. It's got sections going back to 1880. Who are you looking for?" "Marcus Whitmore." "Oh, he's there. Big monument, can't miss it. Prominent family and all." Wes drove to the cemetery in afternoon light that turned everything golden. Hillview sprawled across a hillside, overlooking the Tongue River, rows of headstones marching up the slope like silent sentinels. The old section was at the top, stones worn smooth by wind and time, names and dates barely legible. He found Marcus Whitmore's monument easily, just as the librarian had said. It was a tall granite obelisk, polished and imposing, with the Whitmore name carved on all 4 sides. Marcus's dates, 1886 to 1998, a long life by any measure. Below his name were others: his wife, his children, grandchildren who'd died young, a family tree in stone, but there was no marker for Thomas. Wes walked through the old section, checking every stone, but found nothing. Thomas Whitmore had no grave, no monument, no recognition that he'd ever existed. He'd disappeared into the Montana mountains and vanished from history, leaving behind only a son who'd grown up believing his father had abandoned him. Wes stood at Marcus's monument, imagining what the old man must have felt, growing up poor, while Silas Callahan's family prospered on stolen gold. Had Marcus ever suspected? Had he spent his whole life with a splinter of doubt, wondering if his father's disappearance wasn't as simple as it seemed? "Can I help you?" Wes turned to find a man watching him from a few yards away. He was in his 50s, well-dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, his hair greying at the temples. He had an air of authority about him, the way some men do who are used to being listened to. "Just looking," Wes said carefully. "That's my grandfather's grave," the man said, moving closer. "Marcus Whitmore. I'm David Whitmore." He extended a hand. Wes shook it, his mind racing. Of all the times to run into David Whitmore, here at his grandfather's grave, with the truth burning in his pocket, Wes Callahan. "I'm sorry for your loss, though I guess it's been a while now." 27 years, David said. "But I still come by when I'm in town. He practically raised me after my parents died. Good man, best I ever knew." He studied Wes with sharp eyes. "Callahan, any relation to Ray Callahan out on Highway 59? My uncle, he passed recently." "I'm sorry to hear that. I knew Ray a little way back. He did some work for my grandfather years ago, legal work. Land surveys or something." David smiled, but there was something watchful in his expression. "Small world running into you here." "I was just exploring," Wes said. "Settling Ray's estate, trying to get a sense of the area. Well, if you need anything while you're in town, let me know. I've got an office on 3rd Street Law Practice, though I spend most of my time in Helena these days." They talked for a few more minutes, careful and polite, feeling each other out. David mentioned that he was in Miles City visiting family, that he'd be heading back to the capital in a day or two. Wes mentioned that he was still deciding what to do with Ray's property, whether to sell or hold on to it. When they parted, Wes felt like he'd just survived an interrogation disguised as a friendly chat. David Whitmore was sharp, perceptive, the kind of man who missed nothing. He'd filed Wes's name away, would probably look into him, see if there was any reason a Callahan would be asking questions about the Whitmore family. Wes drove back to the ranch as the sun set, his mind churning. Meeting David had changed things somehow, made the question more immediate. This wasn't just about abstract justice or family honor anymore. There was a real person on the other end of the truth, someone who'd built a life on the belief that his family name meant something honorable. If Wes revealed what Silas had done, he wouldn't just be correcting the historical record. He'd be detonating a bomb in David Whitmore's life, forcing him to confront the fact that his great-grandfather had been murdered and his family cheated. And David had the means to retaliate, to make sure the Callahan name was dragged through the mud so thoroughly that it would never recover. Back at the ranch, Wes returned to the stable in the gathering dusk. He opened the trunk again, looking at the gold coins gleaming in the light of his flashlight. There was a fortune here, enough to change his life completely. He could take it, sell it quietly through dealers who wouldn't ask too many questions, and disappear. Start over somewhere new, leave the whole mess behind. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't do it. His father had raised him better than that, and Ray's letter had made it clear that running away would solve nothing. The truth had a weight to it, a gravity that couldn't be escaped just by changing locations. Wes picked up the Confederate pistol, feeling its weight in his hand. The Callahan name was engraved on the grip, worn but still visible. This had belonged to some ancestor who'd fought in the Civil War, had probably seen terrible things and done terrible things in turn. Had that man struggled with questions of honor and duty, of choosing between loyalty and truth? He set the pistol down and picked up Silas's confession, reading it one more time in the failing light. The old man had written it with a shaking hand, the words betraying his guilt and fear. Whatever else Silas Callahan had been, he'd known what he'd done was wrong. He'd tried to make peace with it before he died, even if that peace had come at the cost of burdening his sons with the truth. And now it was Wes's turn to decide what to do with that burden. He could keep it hidden, as Ray had done, and let the secret die with him. Or he could bring it into the light, accept the consequences, and let the truth finally have its say. Neither choice felt right. Both carried costs that made him ache just thinking about them. But he was beginning to understand that maybe that was the point some decisions weren't about finding the right answer, but about choosing which wrong answer you could live with. Wes closed the trunk and locked it again. He'd sleep on it, give himself time to think. But even as he told himself that, he knew the decision was already forming in the back of his mind, crystallizing slowly like ice on a winter pond. He just needed the courage to admit what it was. The next morning brought rain, a cold drizzle that turned the ranch yard to mud and made everything look grey and miserable. Wes woke in the ranch house. He decided to stay there rather than drive back to the motel, and made coffee in Ray's kitchen, using an old percolator that still sat on the stove. He'd spent the night in his uncle's bed, sleeping in fits and starts, waking every hour or so with his mind churning. By dawn, he was exhausted but oddly clear-headed. The decision he'd been wrestling with felt less impossible now, more like something he could actually do. He was going to tell the truth. Not all of it. Not right away, but enough to start the process. He'd go to David Whitmore, show him the evidence, and let the chips fall where they may. It was what his father would have wanted, what James had argued for all those years ago. And maybe, just maybe, it was the only way to finally put the ghosts to rest. But before he did that, he needed to understand one more thing. Where exactly had Silas buried Thomas Whitmore's body? The confession included rough directions, 3 miles northeast of the Bear Creek claim, in a ravine below a rock formation that looks like a church steeple. Wes spread out a topographical map on the kitchen table and tried to match the description to the terrain. Bear Creek was marked, a thin blue line running through the mountains about 15 miles north of the ranch. 3 miles northeast would put the site in rough country, steep and heavily forested. He spent the day preparing. He found camping gear in Ray's closet along with hiking boots that were only one size too small. He gathered supplies, water, food, a first aid kit, a GPS unit he'd brought from Wyoming. By mid-afternoon, he was ready. The drive to the Bear Creek trailhead took an hour on roads that grew progressively worse, ending at a locked gate marking the boundary of national forest land. Wes parked and continued on foot, following an old mining road that had been reclaimed by vegetation. The rain had stopped, but the forest was dripping, every branch and leaf heavy with water. He hiked for 3 hours, checking his GPS against the map, adjusting his route as the terrain revealed itself. The mountains here were old, worn down by millennia of weather, their slopes covered in lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. In places, he could see evidence of old mining activity, tailings, piles, rusted equipment, the collapsed remains of sluice boxes. When he found the rock formation, it took his breath away. 2 massive granite pillars rose from the mountainside, separated by a narrow gap, their tops weathered into points. With a little imagination, they did look like a church steeple, a natural cathedral in the wilderness, 3 miles northeast. Wes set off again, moving more slowly now, watching for the ravine Silas had described. The terrain was rugged here, broken by gullies and outcrops, everything overgrown and wild. He picked his way carefully, aware that a twisted ankle or broken leg would be serious trouble this far from help. He found the ravine an hour before sunset, a deep cut in the mountainside choked with deadfall and underbrush. It would have been easier to navigate in 1889, before a century of growth had filled it in, but the basic shape was still visible. Wes worked his way down into it, using his hands as much as his feet, until he reached a relatively flat area at the bottom. Here, the forest floor was thick with pine needles and rotting logs. Wes walked the length of the ravine, looking for anything that might mark a grave. He found nothing obvious, no depression in the ground, no pile of stones, no marker of any kind. If Thomas Whitmore was buried here, time and nature had erased all evidence. But then, near the upstream end of the ravine, Wes spotted something odd. A line of rocks that looked deliberately placed, half buried by soil and needles. He knelt and began clearing away the debris, working carefully. The rocks formed a rough rectangle, about 6 feet by 3 feet, the right size and shape for a grave. Wes sat back on his heels, staring at the outline. This was it. Thomas Whitmore had been buried here for 136 years, his body slowly returning to the earth while his family believed he'd simply disappeared. And his killer had gone on to build a ranch, raise a family, and live out his days with the secret locked inside him. Wes pulled out his phone and took photographs from multiple angles, marking the GPS coordinates. Then he carefully replaced the debris, covering the rocks again. He wasn't ready to disturb the site, wasn't sure if he ever would be. But at least now he knew. The story Silas had told was true, or true enough to be verified. He hiked back out in the gathering darkness, using his flashlight to navigate the trail. By the time he reached his truck, he was soaked with sweat despite the cold, his legs trembling with fatigue. But his mind was calm, settled in a way it hadn't been since he'd opened that trunk. He knew what he had to do now. The question was whether he had the strength to see it through. The drive back to Miles City took longer than expected. Wes had to stop twice. Once to close his eyes for 20 minutes when exhaustion made the road swim in front of him, and once to call David Whitmore's office and leave a message asking for a meeting. "It's about family history," he'd said carefully. "Something I think you'd want to know about." By the time he reached the motel, it was after midnight. He collapsed on the bed, fully clothed, and slept, without dreaming, until his phone woke him at 9 the next morning. It was David Whitmore's assistant, returning his call. The senator could meet him at 2 that afternoon at his Miles City office, if that was convenient. Wes said it was, and spent the intervening hours trying to figure out exactly how to present what he'd learned. He couldn't just dump the whole truth on David at once. It was too much, too shocking. He'd need to ease into it, give David time to process each revelation before moving to the next. He dressed carefully in clean jeans and the one button-down shirt he'd brought, wanting to look respectable but not overdressed. Then he gathered the evidence, copies of the letters from the library, photos of the gravesite, and after much deliberation, Silas's written confession. He left the trunk and its contents locked in the stable. Those could wait. David Whitmore's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building downtown, above a real estate office and a tax preparer. The reception area was small but well-appointed, with leather chairs and framed photographs of Montana landscapes on the walls. The assistant, a young woman with efficient movements, showed Wes into David's private office. David stood to greet him, the same watchful expression on his face that Wes remembered from the cemetery. "Mr. Callahan, this is unexpected. Your message mentioned family history." Wes took the offered chair, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "This isn't easy to talk about," he said finally. "But I found something while settling my uncle's estate. Something I think you need to see." He pulled out Thomas Whitmore's letters first, the ones from 1889. David took them carefully, his expression shifting as he read. When he looked up, his face had gone pale. "Where did you get these?" "From the library. They're copies. The originals are in your family's donated papers, but I'm guessing you've never seen them." "No." David's voice was tight. "My grandfather never talked about his father. Never mentioned these letters. Where are you going with this, Mr. Callahan?" Wes took a breath. "My grandfather was Silas Callahan. Your great-grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, was his partner on a gold claim in 1889. According to Thomas's letters, they had a serious disagreement about how to split the proceeds." He paused, letting that sink in. "Thomas disappeared in November of that year. He was never seen again." David's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting my great-grandfather didn't just disappear. You're suggesting something happened to him." "I'm not suggesting. I'm telling you what I know." Wes pulled out Silas's confession and handed it across the desk. My grandfather wrote this before he died in 1942. He left it with his sons, my father and Uncle Ray. It explains what happened on that mountainside. David read in silence, his face growing harder with each line. When he finished, he set the paper down very carefully, as if it might explode. This is a confession to murder. To manslaughter, maybe. Silas claimed it was an accident, a struggle that got out of hand. But yes, he admitted to killing Thomas and hiding the body. Then he took the gold and built the Callahan ranch with it. And your family has known about this for 80 years. David's voice was cold now, all pretense of friendliness gone. You've known that your grandfather murdered mine, stole from him, and left his family to suffer. And you've done nothing. My father wanted to tell the truth, Wes said quietly. He argued for it, tried to convince Ray to come forward. But Ray was afraid of what would happen to the family, so he hid all the evidence and told my father he'd destroyed it. They never spoke again after that. And where's this evidence now? In a trunk in Ray's stable. Gold coins, Civil War relics, and documents related to the claim. Everything Silas took from Thomas. Wes pulled out his phone and showed David the photographs of the grave site. And I found what I believe is Thomas's burial site, based on Silas's description in the confession. It's in the mountains above Bear Creek, exactly where the confession says it would be. David stared at the photographs for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. Why are you telling me this? You could have kept it hidden, sold the gold quietly, and no one would ever have known. Why bring it to me? Because it was the right thing to do, Wes said simply. My father believed that, and I believe it too. The truth matters, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful. The truth, David laughed bitterly, the truth is that my great-grandfather was murdered by yours. That my grandfather grew up poor and fatherless because of your family. That everything the Callahans built was stolen from the Whitmores. He leaned forward. Do you understand what you're giving me, Mr. Callahan? The power to destroy you and everything connected to your name. I could take this to the police, the media, the Historical Society. I could make sure everyone in Montana knows what Silas Callahan did. I know, Wes said. That's why I'm here. Do what you think is right. They sat in silence, the confession lying between them like a live grenade. Outside, Wes could hear traffic sounds, the ordinary noise of a town going about its business, unaware that history was being rewritten in a second-floor office. Finally, David spoke. I need time to think about this. To verify what you've told me, talk to some people. Can you stay in Miles City for a few days? As long as you need. And the trunk? The evidence? Still in the stable. I can show it to you whenever you want. David nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I'll meet you at the ranch, and we'll go through everything together. If what you've told me checks out, then we'll decide what to do next. They shook hands at the door, a formal gesture that felt like sealing a treaty. Wes left the office feeling lighter than he had in days, as if the weight of the secret had been physically pressing down on him and was now partially lifted. He'd done what his father would have wanted. The rest was out of his hands. That evening, Wes sat in Ray's kitchen and wrote his own letter, addressed to his son in Seattle. He explained everything, the discovery, the history, the decision he'd made to come forward. He wrote about James and Ray, about the rift that had divided them and the secret that had poisoned Ray's last decades. And he wrote about the importance of truth, of not letting fear or loyalty override the need to do what was right. He sealed the letter, but didn't mail it. Not yet. First, he'd see what David decided. But either way, his son deserved to know the story, to understand the legacy he'd inherited along with the Callahan name. That night, Wes dreamed of the stable again, but this time it wasn't dark and threatening. In the dream, sunlight streamed through gaps in the walls, and the trunk sat open, empty of gold but full of letters, all the things that should have been said between brothers but never were, all the apologies and explanations that had died with the men who should have spoken them. He woke feeling not peaceful exactly, but resolved. Whatever came next, he'd face it with his eyes open. David Whitmore arrived at the ranch precisely at 10, driving a black SUV that looked out of place on the rutted dirt road. He'd brought someone with him, a woman in her 40s, wearing jeans and a fleece jacket, carrying a camera and a notebook. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen," David said as they climbed out. "She's a forensic archaeologist I know from the university. I asked her to come along to examine the gravesite, if that's all right with you." "Of course," Wes said, though he hadn't expected this. David was being thorough, making sure everything could be verified independently. It made sense, but it also made the whole thing feel suddenly more real, more official. They went to the stable first. Wes unlocked it and led them to the trunk, pulling back the tarp to reveal it in the morning light. David knelt beside it, running his hand over the burned Callahan mark on the lid. "Open it," he said quietly. Wes unlocked the trunk and lifted the lid. The gold gleamed in the dim light, and David drew in a sharp breath. Dr. Chen moved closer, her professional curiosity overcoming any emotional reaction. She pulled out a magnifying glass and examined several of the coins, making notes in her book. "These are authentic," she said after a few minutes. "Late 1800s, most of them. Some are earlier. This pistol," she picked it up carefully, "is Confederate issue. Probably from the 1862. All of this is consistent with the time period you described." David lifted out one of the documents, a map showing the Bear Creek claim, with notations in what must have been Silas's handwriting. His hands were shaking slightly. "This is real. All of—" "There's more," Wes said. He pulled out a leather wallet he'd found deeper in the trunk the night before. Inside were papers identifying Thomas Whitmore as the legal owner of the claim, along with a partnership agreement signed by both Thomas and Silas. "Your great-grandfather's wallet and papers. Silas kept them." David stared at the documents, and Wes saw something in his expression shift, not just anger now, but grief. These were the last things Thomas Whitmore had touched, had carried with him into the mountains where he died. They were evidence, yes, but they were also relics of a life cut short, a man who'd never made it home to his son. "I'd like to see the gravesite," David said finally. They drove in convoy to the trailhead, then hiked in, Dr. Chen setting a brisk pace despite the weight of her equipment. The morning was clear and cold, frost still visible in the shadows. It took them 2 hours to reach the ravine, and when Wes showed them the line of rocks, Dr. Chen immediately began taking photographs and measurements. "This is definitely a burial," she said after examining the site. "The rock placement is deliberate, and the dimensions are right for a human grave. We'd need to excavate to be certain, but I'd say you've found it." David stood at the head of the grave, staring down at the rocks. He was silent for so long that Wes began to wonder if he should say something, but finally David spoke. "My grandfather used to tell me that his father was a good man, that Thomas Whitmore was honest and hard-working, that he'd gone west to make a better life for his family. Growing up, I always wondered why a good man would abandon his son, why he'd stop writing and never come home." "He didn't abandon anyone," Wes said. "He was trying to do right by you all. He just ran into someone who was willing to do wrong to get ahead. Your grandfather." "Yes, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it." David nodded slowly. "What happened to the gold? How much was there originally?" "I don't know exactly. Silas used some of it to buy the ranch and set up operations, but there's still a considerable amount in the trunk. Tens of thousands of dollars worth, maybe more, depending on the current price of gold." "That should have been my family's." "It should have," Wes agreed. "And legally, it probably still is. If you wanted to pursue it, I think you'd have a strong case for claiming the estate." "And the ranch? Would I have a claim to that too?" "I'm not a lawyer, but I'd guess yes. If the ranch was bought with stolen money, then the original purchase was probably fraudulent." They stood in silence, the weight of history pressing down on them. This ravine had held a secret for more than a century, and now 3 people stood in it, deciding what to do with the truth they'd unearthed. Dr. Chen finished her documentation and came to stand with them. "I'll need to file a report with the authorities," she said carefully. "This is a historical gravesite, possibly a crime scene. There are protocols for this kind of discovery." "How long before it becomes public?" David asked. Depends on how we handle it. If we report it immediately, it could be in the news within days. But if we approach it as a historical research project, we might have some control over the timeline. David looked at Wes. What do you want out of this? It was a fair question, and Wes had been asking himself the same thing. I want to do right, by everyone involved. That means acknowledging what my grandfather did, making amends if that's possible, and making sure Thomas Whitmore gets the recognition he deserves. Beyond that, I don't know. You could keep the ranch, David said. Even if we pursue this legally, it would take years to work through the courts. You might be dead before it's resolved. I could, Wes agreed, but I'm not sure I'd want to. Knowing what I know now, living there would feel like living in a stolen house. They hiked back out in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the vehicles, David turned to Wes. I need a few days to think about this, to talk to my family, maybe consult with some lawyers. Can you give me until the end of the week? Take all the time you need, Wes said. I'm not going anywhere. Dr. Chen packed up her equipment and said goodbye, promising to send David a preliminary report within 48 hours. Then she drove off, leaving Wes and David standing in the parking area. For what it's worth, David said, I appreciate what you're doing. It took courage to come forward with this, knowing what it might cost you. It's what my father would have wanted, Wes said. And I think it's what Ray wanted too, in the end. That's why he left me the letter. He couldn't do it himself, but he made sure someone would. They shook hands again, and David climbed into his SUV. Wes watched him drive away, then sat in his own truck for a long time, staring out at the mountains. He felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of hiking. He'd set something in motion now, a process that would play out according to its own logic, and all he could do was wait and see where it led. The next 3 days passed slowly. Wes stayed at the ranch, sorting through Ray's possessions, making piles for donation and disposal. He found photographs he hadn't seen in decades himself as a boy, grinning on a horse. His father and Ray, young and close. His grandmother, dead before he was born, looking stern in a formal portrait. He found Ray's journals too, leather-bound books filled with small, neat handwriting. Ray had been a careful recorder of his life, noting weather patterns, cattle prices, the migration of birds. And in the later volumes, there were occasional entries about the secret he carried. Thought about James today, one entry read. Wondered if I made the right choice. Some days I'm certain. Other days I think I'm a coward who destroyed his brother to save his own skin. Another entry, from just 2 months before Ray's death, left everything to Wes. He's the only one who might understand, who might have the strength to do what I couldn't. Hope I'm not burdening him too much. Hope he can forgive me. Wes read these entries late at night, sitting at Ray's kitchen table with a glass of whiskey he'd found in a cabinet. He felt closer to his uncle in these moments than he'd felt in years of actual visits. Ray had been so guarded in life, so careful to keep people at arm's length. But in these journals the walls came down, and Wes could see the lonely, conflicted man behind them. On the 4th day, David called, "Can you meet me at the cemetery? This afternoon around 3?" Wes agreed, though he wasn't sure what to expect. When he arrived at Hillview Cemetery, he found David standing at Marcus Whitmore's grave, along with an older woman Wes didn't recognize. "This is my aunt, Elizabeth," David said. "Marcus's daughter. I told her everything, showed her the evidence. She wanted to meet you." Elizabeth Whitmore was in her 80s, small and straight-backed, with sharp eyes that reminded Wes of David's. She looked him over carefully before speaking. "My father spent his whole life trying to prove he was worth something, trying to live down the shame of being abandoned. He became a lawyer, then a judge, gave everything to this community, and all along he was running from a lie, the lie that his father had chosen to leave him." "I'm sorry," Wes said. "If I could change what happened—" "You can't," Elizabeth said firmly. "None of us can, but we can decide what to do about it now." She glanced at David, then back at Wes. "We've talked," David and I, along with some other family members. We want to know what you think a fair resolution would look like." Wes hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be asked for his input on his own punishment, essentially. "I think the gold should go to your family. It was stolen from Thomas, so it rightfully belongs to his descendants. As for the ranch, I'm willing to sign it over if that's what you want. Though the legal process might be complicated, the ranch has been in your family for over 100 years, David said. Whatever my great-grandfather's claim to it might have been, that's a long time. And you weren't the one who committed the crime. You're just the one who inherited the consequences. So what are you proposing? Wes asked. David and Elizabeth exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then David spoke. We want to tell the truth, make it public. Not as a scandal, but as a historical correction. We want Thomas Whitmore's name cleared, his story told properly. And we want him to have a proper burial, here with the rest of the family. I can agree to that, Wes said. What about the gold and the ranch? Keep the ranch, Elizabeth said. It's yours, whatever, its origins. But the gold should be used for something good, something that honors both families. I was thinking a scholarship fund, maybe, or a community center. Something that helps people instead of just sitting in a trunk gathering dust. Wes felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since he'd first opened that trunk. This was more generous than he'd dared to hope for, more focused on healing than revenge. That sounds right. That sounds like something both our grandfathers would approve of, if they'd been better men. They spent the next hour discussing details, working out a rough plan for how to proceed. Dr. Chen would lead an official excavation of the gravesite, recovering Thomas's remains for proper burial. A local historian would be brought in to document the story, working with both families to ensure accuracy. The gold would be liquidated and placed in a trust, with representatives from both the Callahan and Whitmore families serving as trustees. And the ranch? Wes would keep it, but with a conservation easement to ensure it would never be developed, would remain open space in perpetuity. It felt right somehow taking something that had been built on theft and transforming it into something that served the common good. As they walked back to their cars, Elizabeth touched Wes's arm. My father would have liked you, she said. He was big on making amends, on people taking responsibility for their mistakes. What you've done here, coming forward like this, that took character. I had a good teacher, Wes said, thinking of his father. He taught me that truth matters more than comfort. Your father was James, wasn't he? Ray's brother? Yes. Ray used to talk about him sometimes. Years ago, when he'd come to town, you could tell it hurt him, not being able to reconcile. He'd get this look, like he was carrying something too heavy to set down. She smiled sadly. Maybe now he can finally rest, knowing the truth came out in the end. Wes drove back to the ranch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He felt different somehow, not lighter exactly, but more settled. The burden of the secret was still there, would always be there in some sense, but it had been transformed from a private weight into a shared responsibility. He wasn't carrying it alone anymore. That night, he called his son in Seattle. They hadn't spoken in months, the distance between them more than just geographical. But Wes wanted to tell him what had happened, wanted to explain the choice he'd made and why it mattered. His son listened in silence as Wes told the story, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing the information. When Wes finished, there was a long pause before his son spoke. So you're giving up a fortune and potentially the ranch, just to tell the truth about something that happened over 100 years ago? Yes, Wes said, because it's the right thing to do. Pause. Then, I'm proud of you, Dad. I know that's not something I say often, but I am. You're doing what Grandpa James would have wanted. The words hit Wes harder than he'd expected, bringing unexpected tears to his eyes. Thank you, he managed. That means a lot. They talked for another hour, the longest conversation they'd had in years. His son told him about his job, his life in Seattle, the woman he was seeing. Wes told him about the ranch, about Ray, about the discoveries he'd made in the stable. And somewhere in that conversation, the distance between them began to close, not all the way, but enough to matter. When they finally said goodbye, Wes sat in the dark kitchen, feeling more connected to his family, past, present, and future than he had in decades. The truth had cost him something, would continue to cost him things as the story became public, but it had also given him something back, a sense of integrity, of having done right, even when it was hard. The excavation took place on a cold October morning, supervised by Dr. Chen and a team from the State Archaeological Office. Wes and David were both there, along with Elizabeth and several other Whitmore family members. They stood back while the team carefully worked, removing soil layer by layer, documenting everything with photographs and measurements. It took 3 hours before they found the remains, exactly where Silas's confession had indicated. The bones were fragile, stained dark by time, but intact enough to confirm that this was indeed a human burial. Dr. Chen carefully uncovered the skeleton, noting details that would help with identification. Male, approximately 30 to 40 years old, she said, working with calm professionalism. Height, about 5'10", evidence of a healed fracture in the left forearm, consistent with a childhood injury. She looked up at David. Does any of that match Thomas Whitmore's description? David pulled out a paper. According to family records, Thomas broke his arm, falling out of a tree when he was 8. He was 5'9", and he would have been 33 when he disappeared. Then I'd say we've found him, Dr. Chen said quietly. The team worked through the afternoon, recovering every fragment, every scrap of evidence. They found buttons from Thomas's clothing, the remains of leather boots, and still clutched in the bony fingers of his right hand, a small cross on a chain. Elizabeth began crying when she saw it, and David put his arm around her shoulders. My father had one just like it, Elizabeth said. He said his mother told him it belonged to Thomas, that she'd sent it to him before he left for Montana. We always thought it was lost. The cross was carefully documented and removed, along with everything else. The remains were placed in a specially prepared container to be transported to Miles City for proper burial. The gravesite itself would be marked with a plaque explaining what had happened here and honoring Thomas Whitmore's memory. As they prepared to leave, Wes stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the empty space where Thomas had lain for so long. He thought about Silas standing in this same spot, covering the grave with rocks, knowing that he was burying more than just a body. He was burying the truth, burying his own guilt, trying to bury the consequences of his actions. But the truth had a way of coming out eventually. It might take decades, even centuries, but it came out. And when it did, people had to decide what to do with it, whether to hide it again or bring it into the light. Wes had chosen light. Whatever came next, he could live with that choice. The funeral took place on a Saturday morning in November, with an early snow dusting the cemetery and making everything clean and white. Thomas Whitmore's remains were interred in the family plot, next to Marcus's monument. A new headstone had been commissioned, simple and dignified, with Thomas's name and dates and a single line, "Gone, but not forgotten." More than 200 people attended Whitmore's and Callahan's. Townspeople who'd heard the story, historians and archaeologists who'd been following the case. The local newspaper had run a front-page story the week before, explaining the whole saga in careful detail. The response had been mostly positive, with editorial writers praising both families for their handling of a difficult situation. There had been some criticism, of course. Some people thought Wes should have kept the secret, protected his family's name. Others thought the Whitmores should have pressed charges, should have fought for everything they could get. But most people seemed to understand that this was a complex situation with no perfect answers, and both families had done their best to find a way forward. The service was simple, conducted by a retired minister who'd known Marcus Whitmore. He spoke about justice and mercy, about the importance of truth and the possibility of redemption. He talked about how easy it is to judge people from the past, forgetting that they faced impossible choices, just like people do today. When he finished, David stepped forward to say a few words. He talked about Thomas, about the man he'd been and the family he'd left behind. He talked about Marcus, about how the loss of his father had shaped him but not broken him. And he talked about forgiveness, not forgiving what Silas had done, but forgiving the burden of anger and resentment that came with it. "We can't change the past," David said, his voice carrying across the snowy cemetery, "but we can choose how we respond to it. My family could have used this as a weapon, could have destroyed the Callahans in revenge for what was done to us, but that would have just created more pain, more division. Instead, we're choosing to acknowledge the truth and move forward together, honoring both Thomas Whitmore and the principle that truth matters more than pride." Then it was Wes's turn. He spoke briefly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm here to apologize on behalf of my grandfather, Silas Callahan, for what he did to Thomas Whitmore and the family Thomas left behind. I'm here to acknowledge that my family's prosperity was built on theft and tragedy, and that we should have come forward with this truth decades ago. And I'm here to promise that the Callahan name will be used from now on to honor truth and justice, not to hide from them." After the service, people mingled in small groups, talking quietly. Wes found himself standing with David and Elizabeth, the three of them watching as flowers were placed on Thomas's grave. "What will you do now?" Elizabeth asked Wes. "Go back to Wyoming, I think. Finish out the season at Patterson's spread. After that," he shrugged, "I'm not sure. Maybe retire, spend more time at Ray's ranch. It's peaceful up there." "You're keeping it then, for now? Seems like that's what everyone wants." "Good," Elizabeth said firmly. "That land has history, good and bad. It should stay with someone who understands that." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, until the crowd began to disperse. As people headed to their cars, Wes noticed something he hadn't seen before: members of both families talking together, sharing stories, bridging the gap that had divided them for so long. The Whitmore-Callahan feud, if it had ever really been a feud, was over. Winter came early that year, with heavy snows closing the mountain passes by mid-November. Wes spent Thanksgiving at the ranch, alone but not lonely, cooking a simple meal and eating it while watching snow fall past the kitchen window. He'd invited his son to come visit, and surprisingly, he'd agreed they'd planned a week together over Christmas. In the evenings, Wes read through more of Ray's journals, getting to know his uncle in a way he'd never managed when Ray was alive. He found humor in the journals, and wisdom, and occasional moments of surprising vulnerability. Ray had been a complicated man, carrying a burden that had isolated him from everyone he cared about. But he'd also been a man who'd cared deeply about doing right, even when he wasn't sure what right looked like. One entry, from the early 1980 seconds, stood out. "James was right. I see that now. The truth should have come out, no matter the cost. I thought I was protecting the family, but all I did was poison it. Maybe someday, someone will find what I've hidden and have the courage I lacked. God willing, they'll make a better choice than I did." Wes closed the journal and looked out at the snowy landscape. Ray had made his peace with the decision, eventually, and he'd set things up so that the truth could emerge, even if he couldn't bring himself to reveal it directly. In the end, maybe that was the best he could do. The scholarship fund was established in January, jointly named for Thomas Whitmore and James Callahan, honoring both the man who'd been wronged and the man who'd argued for truth. It would provide college scholarships for students from Miles City and the surrounding area, with preference given to those studying history, archaeology, or ethics. The fund was endowed with the proceeds from the gold, more than enough to provide multiple scholarships in perpetuity. At the announcement ceremony, both families were present, standing together on the stage. Wes gave a brief speech explaining the history and the reasoning behind the fund. "This money was born from tragedy," he said, "but we're transforming it into something hopeful, something that helps young people learn and grow. That feels like the right way to honor both Thomas Whitmore and the principle that brought us here, the principle that truth and justice matter even when they're hard." The local press covered the event, and the story spread from there. National media picked it up, fascinated by the tale of an old wrong finally being made right. Wes did a few interviews, always careful to focus on the principles involved rather than the sensational details. He didn't want this to be about scandal or family drama. He wanted it to be about the possibility of redemption, of making amends, even after decades had passed. In March, as winter finally began releasing its grip, Wes's son came for a visit that stretched into a week, then two. They worked together on the ranch, fixing fences and clearing brush, talking in a way they hadn't done since his son was young. The distance between them, built up over years of neglect and misunderstanding, began to crumble. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, his son said, "I've been thinking about what you did, coming forward with the truth. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Wes admitted. "Still isn't sometimes. There are people who think I betrayed the family, that I should have kept the secret. But you don't regret it?" Wes considered the question carefully. "No. I regret that it happened in the first place, that my grandfather made the choices he made, but I don't regret revealing it. Some things are too big to hide forever." His son nodded. "I think Grandpa James would be proud of you." "I know I am." It was the second time his son had said that, and it still hit Wes with the force of a physical blow. He'd spent so much of his life feeling like he'd disappointed people, his father, his ex-wife, his son, but in this one thing, at least, he'd done right. He'd honored his father's principles and made a choice that felt true to who he wanted to be. "Thank you." Wes said quietly. "That means the world to me." They sat in silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The ranch stretched out before them, the land that had been bought with stolen gold but would now serve a better purpose. Wes thought about all the people who'd lived here over the decades, the choices they'd made, and the consequences they'd lived with. He thought about Silas and Thomas, about Ray and James, about the way history echoed forward through generations, shaping lives in ways both visible and hidden. And he thought about the future, about the students who'd receive scholarships bearing the names of two men who'd never met, but whose lives had been tragically intertwined. Those students would learn and grow, would make their own choices and face their own dilemmas. And maybe, just maybe, they'd remember the story behind their scholarships and understand that doing right wasn't always easy, but it was always possible. The stars came out one by one as darkness fell. Wes and his son stayed on the porch, talking about small things and big things, about the past and the future and the present moment they were sharing. And in that moment, Wes felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle or doubt, but the deep peace that comes from knowing you've done your best, that you've honored the people who mattered most to you, that you've chosen truth over comfort and integrity over ease. In the stable, the trunk sat empty now, its contents dispersed to their proper homes. But it remained where Ray had left it, a reminder of secrets kept and secrets revealed, of burdens carried and burdens shared. Wes planned to leave it there, a piece of family history that would tell its story to whoever came after him, because that was the thing about truth. Once it was out, it changed things. It didn't erase the past or undo the damage, but it created the possibility of something better. It allowed for healing, for understanding, for the kind of complicated forgiveness that acknowledged wrong without being consumed by it. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting to reveal brown grass that would soon turn green. Wes worked the ranch with his son's help, planning modest improvements, thinking about the future. He was 60 years old, not young but not done yet. He had time to make something good from all of this, to build a legacy that his father and uncle could be proud of. And when he sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the same mountains Silas had crossed all those years ago, he felt connected to something larger than himself, a story that had begun long before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. He was just one chapter in that story, but it was a chapter he'd written as well as he knew how, with honesty and courage and a commitment to truth. That was enough. It had to be enough. And sitting there in the gathering darkness, feeling the weight of inheritance finally transformed into something he could carry, Wes Callahan believed that maybe, just maybe, it was